Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes. Hi, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Christina Miller, and I am the president of the Society of Government Economists. I would like to welcome you here today to our SGE virtual seminar series. Our presentation today is on problems of compliance with sanctions on Russia and Iran. We have two excellent speakers today, Tyler Grove and Patricia Shoker. And we will get started with introductions in 1 minute. For more information about SGE and membership, please visit our website at sge-econ.org. You can also follow us on X and Facebook to learn more about our upcoming SGE events. Our SGE mission statement is that SGE supports the professional development of government economists and economists interested in the economics of public policy. So I'm going to pass it over to Mel to do the introductions.
Hi, Christina. I'm not sure if Mel is on, not muted, or he might be
Yeah,
muted.
Mel, I think you might be on mute. Let me see if I can unmute. I cannot.
Unmute, okay.
Okay,
Well,
yep,
I don't
there
have
we
to see
go, Mel.
myself. You hear me, right? Everyone can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so let me continue. Since the onset of the Russian war in Ukraine in 2022, the United States, United Kingdom, and the European Union, among others, have implemented over 16,000 sanctions against Russia. Sanctions imposed on Iran cover Iranian sectors, entities, and individuals. Sanctions on both Russia and Iran have not been as effective as originally designed, potentially due to critical supplies entering Russia and Iran through other countries. Join us for a compelling seminar on how sanctions have fallen short. And our first speaker is Tyler Grove. Tyler Grove is a partner in the International Trade Practice Group at Akin, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld, LLP. He has over a decade of experience in advising domestic and international clients on sanctions and export matters, such as cutting-edge regulatory development and the formation and implementation of compliance programs, and in leading complex internal investigations and guiding companies through the voluntary self-disclosure process. I'm pleased to present Dr. Tyler Grove. Tyler Grove.
Thank you, Mel, and thank you, Christina, and thank you everyone else for joining us today. Let me see if I can share my screen briefly. Great. Well, as Mel mentioned, my name is Tyler Grove. I'm a partner at Akin Gump in the International Trade Group, specializing in sanctions as well as export controls. And I'll be presenting today on sanctions. So just as a quick agenda to level set, today we'll be covering just a background on sanctions generally. Then we'll dig in a little bit deeper into the Russia and Iran sanctions programs, respectively. And then I'll cover some sanctions policy lessons learned from the past few years. My colleague Patricia will then cover sanctions and geopolitical impact, sanctions on Russia's energy and minerals, followed by a discussion on uranium dependency and future directions. We'll follow up our presentation then with an opportunity for some questions and answers. So jumping into sanctions backgrounds. So what are sanctions? Well, sanctions are rapidly becoming the bleeding edge of US foreign policy, in part because they're really seen as an alternative to kinetic or military force. In short, there are restrictions that are imposed by our government and others against countries, entities, and individuals, and they restrict transactions and dealings, which are broadly interpreted terms with those sanctioned countries, persons, or entities. We, of course, are not the only country that can impose sanctions, and as with the case with Russia, other countries can impose their own sanctions, including countermeasures in response. Within the US, there are multiple agencies that are involved in forming, administering, and enforcing our sanctions policy. The first is the Department of Treasury, Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. OFAC is really the primary stakeholder because they administer and do civil enforcement of sanctions. They also are empowered to freeze the assets of blocked parties. And they work very closely with the State Department in forming sanctions policy. The U.S. Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security, on the other hand, is responsible for U.S. dual export controls. And as we'll discuss, they have a role, especially with respect to comprehensively embargoed territories. They also have their own designation authority where they can place certain entities on export control blacklists. In turn, the Justice Department is responsible for criminal enforcement of sanctions violations, that is, those that are conducted willfully. And Congress, on the other hand, provides the statutory authority underlying our sanctions, and they can also initiate investigations of the administration and enforcement of US sanctions. So the basis for US sanctions typically starts with a statute. The main statute in the US is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, but there are others, including the Trading with the Enemy Act, which, for example, authorizes the Cuban sanctions. There are currently 38 sanctions programs administered by OFAC. So there's no one overarching set of regulations. Rather, each program will have its own regulations that apply to the program. And there's significant overlap between each program, but there are some distinct differences. So it's important to consider which program might apply to a transaction and review those regulations very carefully. Conceptually, it's helpful, I think, to think of sanctions as grouped into these different categories. The most restrictive are the comprehensively embargoed territories. And these would include, for example, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Syria, as well as the currently occupied territories of Ukraine. That is Crimea, the Donetsk People's Republic, and the Luhansk People's Republic. Below that, there are some territories that are not quite comprehensively embargoed, but they're pretty close, and there's significant risk there. And those would include Russia, which we'll discuss in just a few minutes, Belarus, Venezuela, and Burma, also known as Myanmar. And then most other sanctions programs are what's known as limited sanctions. That is, the entire country or sectors within the economy are not necessarily targeted, but rather specific individuals within that country are targeted. Not all sanctions programs are country-specific either, it's important to realize. Some will target specific bad behavior, such as terrorist activities, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, violation of human rights, and other activities that are seen as contrary to US foreign policy. So just visually, it's helpful, I think, to see kind of where on a map we've imposed sanctions. You can see in orange are the territories that have significant sanctions. Dark purple are the comprehensively embargoed territories. And then everywhere else has more limited sanctions. And as noted in the circle on the left hand of the slide, the activity-based sanctions programs, those sanctioned individuals could be located anywhere, including the United States. So within sanctions, there are really three different levels. There's the comprehensive territorial embargoes, which really have two components to them. There's the restrictions on US persons and US goods that apply on the sanction side. And there's also restrictions on the export of US goods, software, and technology, which are on the export control side. More relevant to our discussion today, most sanctions programs are going to fall into this primary sanctions category. And these work by restricting the activities of US persons. And so to have jurisdiction, they typically require what's known as a US nexus, or a US person somewhere within the transactional chain. As we'll discuss a bit later, this has been interpreted broadly so that OFAC can actually apply primary sanctions even to non-US companies if they have a US person indirectly involved. Perhaps most controversially, there are secondary sanctions, and these give the US government the ability rather to add to a sanctions list parties that are engaging in transactions seen as contrary to US foreign policy or US national security, even in the absence of a US nexus. And while all sanctions programs do have some level of secondary sanctions, there are only a few that have a really significant risk there. And those would include, for example, Iran, Russia, and North Korea. So just to briefly cover territorial embargoes, these always apply to US persons. For example, a US person cannot engage generally in transactions involving Cuba, subject to certain exceptions. They also apply to non-US persons if you're dealing in goods that are subject to US jurisdiction. And these would include things like US origin, goods, software, technology, anything physically present in the United States, things that contain more than what's known as a de minimis amount of US content, which is typically 25%, but for the comprehensively embargoed territories, it's only 10%, or certain goods, software, technology that are the direct product of US software or technology, even if those are not themselves US origin items. So U.S. primary sanctions, as I mentioned, require a U.S. nexus, and this can really come in a lot of different forms. This can involve, obviously, a U.S. person, which might be an investor, an employee of a company. It could be a bank that's transferring from one currency into U.S. dollars. It could also involve people or items that are physically in the United States. People who are in the United States, regardless of nationality, are considered U.S. persons under the U.S. sanctions, as well as anything that's in the United States, regardless of where it was made or developed, is considered subject to U.S. jurisdiction. And it could also include U.S. origin items. On the horizon, there are some questions as to how we apply sanctions to things like data flowing through U.S. servers, whether that's a sufficient nexus to impose sanctions on a transaction that might be pinged through, for example, an Amazon server located in the United States. So who is a U.S. person? This would include any U.S. citizens and permanent residents or green card holders. As I mentioned, anybody that's physically in the United States or any entity formed under the U.S. law. It would not include usually subsidiaries of U.S. companies located outside of the United States, but there are two exceptions. And under the Cuba and Iran sanctions programs, they extend the concept of U.S. person to include those subsidiaries of U.S. owners or U.S. parent companies. Most primary sanctions programs operate through the designation of sanctions targets on a list called the Specially Designated Nationals List, or SDNs. This is the most severe sanctions blacklist that the United States has, and it mechanically requires U.S. persons to block all property or interest in property of the designated SDN. In effect, it prohibits U.S. persons from engaging in any transaction with an SDN directly or indirectly. Several years ago, the SDN list, before sanctions really took off, it was actually readable. You could sit down and read it in one sitting and tell if somebody was on there or not. Currently, the printed version of the list is over 2,500 pages long. And so really, the use of screening tools and software is more typically used now to check if an entity or person is on the SDN list. It's not as easy, though, as simply checking whether a person or entity is on the SDN list, because OFAC extends those restrictions to any entity that's owned 50% or more by a sanctioned party. This makes it tricky because it's direct or indirect ownership, and it also considers sanctioned ownership in the aggregate. And so you really have to consider the entire ownership chain of a party in determining whether or not they could be subject to sanctions. So you can see in some of the examples here, in entity one that's owned 75% by an SDN, so that's clearly above the 50% threshold. Entity two is exactly 50%, but it's still blocked because it's 50% or more, so it meets that threshold. Same with entity three. Here you have two SDNs that each own 25%, so together they own 50%, which meets the threshold. And only in entity four do you see an SDN that has ownership less than 50%. So entity four would not be blocked, but that would still be considered a red flag in transacting with that entity. The SDN list is not the only sanctions list. There are some lesser sanctions lists that impose restrictions that aren't nearly as restrictive as the SDN list. These would include the sectoral sanctions list, which apply to the debt and equity transactions of certain Russian companies. There's a catch-all list for all sorts of non-blocking restrictions, known as the non-SDN menu-based sanctions list. This could include things like visa restrictions, restrictions on access to U.S. markets, and debt and equity restrictions. And there are a variety of other lists as well. We're planning to circulate these slides after the presentation for reference, but just for background, it's helpful to be aware of these lists. So as I mentioned, the United States, despite the fact that U.S. primary sanctions require the involvement of a U.S. person, they found ways to extend this jurisdiction extra-jurisdictionally. And the primary way they do this is through a concept of causing liability. And what this says is a legal kind of fiction that says, even in a transaction between one non-U.S. person and another non-U.S. person that would be otherwise prohibited under sanctions if there was a U.S. person involved, that could be a violation of U.S. primary sanctions if it would involve a U.S. person indirectly. And so the most common way this comes up is through the use of U.S. dollars. So most U.S. dollars must be cleared through a U.S.-based correspondent bank account. And the theory goes is that the non-U.S. parties could cause that U.S. correspondent bank to violate sanctions by attempting the U.S. dollar transaction, and therefore those non-U.S. parties could also be in violation of the sanctions. There's some other ways this may involve, this could be involved. For example, if you're trying to send a part or component that was made in a comprehensively embargoed territory to a U.S. person without telling them, in theory, you could cause them to violate sanctions as well, but it typically comes up in U.S. dollar transactions. And so again, just to illustrate this a bit more clearly, if you have a non-U.S. factory in Canada selling to a sanctioned customer in Venezuela in U.S. dollars, that sanctioned customer in Venezuela would go to their bank to attempt to convert their local currency into U.S. dollars. That would be pinged over to a correspondent bank account in the U.S. held by the Venezuelan bank before going to the Canadian bank for payment to the Canadian factory. But the U.S. correspondent bank almost always would detect the sanctioned Venezuelan party, and they would block the transaction at that point, and they would block the wire payment. The other kind of other side of the coin to causing liability is this concept of facilitating liability, and every sanctions program has both causing and facilitating concepts within it. Facilitation says that a U.S. person can't facilitate a transaction between non-U.S. persons if it would be prohibited for a U.S. person to engage in it. So the classic example of this is if you're a U.S. person, you get a call from somebody in Iran, for example, and they want you to sell something to them, and you say, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that, but talk to my colleague in Europe. They can sell to you. That would be considered facilitating a sanctioned transaction, and that referral of business itself could be a violation of the sanctions. So where causing liability, it places the liability on the non-U.S. persons. Facilitating liability is just the opposite. It places the liability on U.S. persons if they try to refer out a sanctioned transaction. There are other ways that a U.S. person could facilitate a sanctioned transaction. And OFAC has interpreted this extremely broadly, and we have some examples up on the screen, where they can include things even like strategy discussions involving a sanctioned territory, changing corporate policies to allow a sanctioned transaction to go forward, or otherwise like giving your approval for a contract or a review of like an agreement if you're a U.S. person, and that would facilitate a sanctioned transaction. So secondary sanctions, as I mentioned earlier, would not require a U.S. nexus. And these are, again, among the most controversial because these are truly extraterritorial penalties. They allow the United States to sanction entities that are engaging in transactions totally outside of the United States, but which are nevertheless seen as violating U.S. foreign policy interests or U.S. national security interests. Most recently, we're seeing a lot of this with secondary sanctions being imposed on Chinese banks and other Chinese companies that are supplying Russian companies on a theory that those transactions are furthering Russia's ability to facilitate its invasion of Ukraine. Because these are controversial, typically they must be either material or significant before liability could arise. Most primary sanctions, on the other hand, are strict liability, meaning that even minor technical violations could create liability. But secondary sanctions are more of a policy-based factual analysis. They typically would result in the targeted entities being added to the SDN list, but there are a variety of other options that OFAC could impose depending on the policy interests at play, including the denial of export privileges, financial restrictions, procurement bans, debt and equity restrictions, the denial of certain export-import assistance, visa bans, especially on individuals, and then correspondent and pay-through accounts if it's a financial institution. Essentially, their secondary sanctions are trying to force companies to make the decision to either support the sanctioned target or support the United States. The penalties for sanctions violations can be severe. The civil violation, which again is assessed under strict liability, is either the greater of roughly $370,000 or twice the value of the transaction per violation. And OFAC interprets violations very broadly, so even related violations can end up snowballing to an extremely significant penalty. Criminal violations, that is, those that are conducted willfully, could have up to a $1 million fine per violation and 20 years in imprisonment. And there are a variety of other collateral things that could happen as well. For example, you could be put on some other lesser blacklist, or on the SDN list, or the export control blacklist. You could have a breach of other contractual commitments if those agreements have sanctions compliance clauses. And then there are significant reputational costs too with a sanctions violation. So just to take a bit of a deeper dive into the Russia and Iran sanctions programs. So the Russia sanctions program has existed since around 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea. Since that time, there's been a steady escalation of the restrictions on Russia. But things really took off in February of 2022 after Russia and sort of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. You can see there was all sorts of designation activities and other restrictions that were imposed in that year alone. Primarily, the Russia sanctions so far have been driven by SDN designations, and those have been significant. The financial industry in particular has been hit very hard, and currently, I think over 90 to 95% of Russian banks are subject to SDN restrictions, making it very hard to get money in or out of the country, even though it's not technically comprehensively embargoed. A significant number of Russian government entities are also on the SDN list, although unlike Venezuela, the full government is not yet considered a blocked party. The Russia sanctions program since 2022 has also been a bit fascinating because OFAC's been exploring a lot of different ways it can make targeted restrictions without resorting solely to the SDN restrictions. So for example, there's been a comprehensive embargo imposed on the occupied areas of Ukraine. There's been a ban on any new investment by US persons, no matter where they're located in the world. There's been a variety of financial restrictions imposed on Russian banks. This was primarily before they were added to the SDN list. But this would restrict the ability of US persons, for example, to give them loans or purchase their bonds or even their securities, basically trying to avoid US person providing new capital for the Russian financial market. And then the aerospace industry has also been hit very hard. In particular, there's been a airspace ban over the United States, as well as, I believe, most of Europe. And then a number of aircraft that were essentially stolen by Russian airlines after the war that were on lease have been put on the export control blacklist. There's also been a ban on US services to Russian individuals located in Russia. Most prominently, this has been on the accounting, trust, and corporate formation services. Again, this is really targeting the ability of Russian companies to access brain power, essentially, to form shell companies and move their assets around. There's also been restrictions on quantum computing services, the transport of crude oil, architecture and engineering, and this is primarily aimed at the rebuilding of the occupied territories. For example, the building of the bridge that linked Crimea to mainland Russia, acquisition of Russian origin minerals, and most recently, 2 weeks ago, there was an information technology and software services ban announced, and that will become effective later in September. There's also an import ban on a number of Russian origin items, obviously energy products, which are a core part of the economy, but also fish, seafood, alcoholic beverages, non-industrial diamonds, gold, and a number of other minerals, including uranium, which Patricia will speak to in just a few minutes. And then there's been essentially a ban on transactions involving the central bank of Russia and related institutions. So it's not an SDN technically, but US persons are prohibited from engaging in transactions with the central Russian government financial institutions. Notwithstanding these restrictions, a number of countries around the world, including Europe, are dependent on Russian crude oil, natural gas, and other petroleum products. And so, short of banning those outright, as is the case with Iran, there's been a price cap imposed on Russian crude and petroleum products. This has been done in coordination with the UK and EU, and it also prohibits certain services involved with transporting Russian oil, trading it, financing it, shipping it, etc. Certain sectors of the Russian economy have been targeted more than others. I mentioned the banking financial services sector, the military sector, obviously, technology, but also, interestingly, luxury goods have been one targeted sector, as have been architecture, engineering, construction, quantum computing. These really go hand in hand with the services bans that we just spoke about just a few seconds ago. It's not just sanctions on Russia. There's also significant export controls that have been imposed. So everything on the commerce control list now requires a license when going to Russia. There's also been a ban on things that aren't on the commerce control list that are identified on certain schedules within the Export Administration regulations. I mean, these are mostly industrial goods and the luxury goods that I mentioned. So even if these are subject to the lowest level of controls, if they're subject to US jurisdiction, they can't go to Russia. The jurisdictional hook over Russia has also been expanded. So even non-US origin items that are produced using US software technology or equipment made from US software technology are considered subject to US jurisdiction, and they would be subject to these same export restrictions. Also restrictions on anything destined for a military end user or end use. And then there's been multiple entities put on the so-called entity list. This is the equivalent of the SDN list on the export control side, and essentially imposes a license requirement on anything subject to US export control jurisdiction. And as I mentioned earlier, there's been a number of aircraft that have also been targeted under this novel use of a so-called General Prohibition 10, which essentially requires a license for any person who provides services, parts, or otherwise engage with that aircraft once it's on that list. There's been quite a few secondary sanctions imposed with respect to Russia as well. I mentioned the Chinese banks, other Chinese suppliers. There's been a number against Iran and Iranian companies too, primarily because Iran is currently supplying parts and components for drones being used by Russia in Ukraine. The authority for this comes from the primary executive order underlying the Russia program that's being used for the most recent designations. This is Executive Order 14024. And like most sanctions executive orders, this includes a clause that says that OFAC may designate any party that's been determined to have materially assisted, sponsored, or provided financial, material, technological support for a sanctioned party. This is known as the material assistance provision, and it's the primary source for secondary sanctions here. And beyond OFAC, there's been a number of states that have imposed their own sanctions targeting Russia. These have been primarily used through state retirement funds, saying that those retirement funds can't invest in companies either in Russia or sometimes with the most restrictive companies that do business even with Russian companies. So with the Iran sanctions program, and I'll just cover this pretty quickly. So this has been around for quite a while. It's a countrywide program that prohibits almost all unlicensed activities and transactions with persons or entities in Iran. It's really spread over 4 regulations, but the primary set of regulations is known as the Iranian Transactions and Sanctions Regulations, or the ITSR. And that's the one that imposes most commercial activity with Iran. The restrictions would include things like a prohibition on any supply directly or indirectly bought from the US or by a US person of any goods, technology, or services, anything involving Iranian origin items. And this gets tricky sometimes. This would include things even like Persian rugs that have been outside of Iran before the Islamic Revolution. So the jurisdiction can extend that far. It would also include any transaction involving the government of Iran, which is essentially treated the same as an SDN. In fact, the government of Iran is almost a super SDN because it not only includes entities owned 50% or more by the government of Iran, but also any entity controlled by the government of Iran is also subject to these restrictions. And as we mentioned, it would also include the facilitation by a U.S. person of any transaction that would otherwise be prohibited. Secondary sanctions on Iran are robust. They typically target the petroleum market, but there's a number of other sectors that have also been targeted here, including transactions involving the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. That's kind of an elite military unit within Iran that runs a large swath of its economy. It could include trade in precious metal and other sectors of Iran's economy that are deemed critical. There's been a number of new sanctions designations in Iran since October 7th. That's the start of the Israel war against Hamas, and is primarily with respect to Iran's support of Hamas and the Houthis in Yemen that are firing rockets into Israel. U.S. export controls on Iran are also robust. Similar to Russia, they require a license for anything on the Commerce Control List. There's also a new foreign direct product rule that targets Iran. Unlike Russia, though, it's a bit more limited, and it's limited more towards technology and software that's used to make drone components, again, targeting that supply to Russia for the drones that are being used in the war with Ukraine. Most license applications are reviewed under a policy of denial. There's an exception for aviation safety, which are reviewed on a case-by-case basis. But a number of Iranian airlines are on the SDN list themselves. And when you have an SDN involved, it's almost always going to be denied. With both Russia and Iran, when you have both an export control issue and a sanctions issue, you need to get a license from both BIS and OFAC, which can increase the difficulty of getting authorization. There are a number of other non-sanctioned trade restrictions as well. One of the most significant here is the disclosure requirement under Section 219 of the Iran Threat Reduction Act. This requires all publicly traded companies in the U.S., whether or not they themselves are a U.S. company, to disclose any significant commercial activity they have with Iran. So again, it's not really a legal liability that's created here, but it's more of a reputational risk by causing these companies to have to put their hand up and potentially suffer the reputational effects of that disclosure. So just to quickly wrap up my section, some sanctions policy lessons that have been learned over the past few years. I think the first one has been the effectiveness of multilateral sanctions versus unilateral sanctions. So since February 2022, with the Russia sanctions, this is the first time that we've seen a closely coordinated sanctions effort between the US, EU, and UK. Prior to that time, it was typically the US taking an action, and maybe like 6 months, a year, 2 years later, the EU might do something. It might look different than what the US did, and it could cause like a lot of confusion. But here, it's been closely coordinated, both in timing of the restrictions. So, you know, they tend to come out, if not on the same day, within a few days of each other, as well as with the scope of the restrictions. And there are some differences, nevertheless, but the large overlap, I think, has really assisted companies that have potential exposure in both the US and EU with understanding those restrictions and complying with them. And it also, I think, reduces the impact of the targets, the sanctions targets, to find alternative supply chains when both the US, EU, UK, oftentimes Japan and other Western allied countries are all taking similar steps. This was also the first time that we've seen the EU and UK really build out their sanctions programs. They were extremely limited, I think, prior to 2022. And that's something I think it'll be fascinating to watch because it could be leveraged to support multilateral actions in the future. So hopefully we'll see more coordinated actions like this now that regulatory infrastructure is now in place. Prior to that, the US has tried unilateral sanctions before. the most famously with the Cuba sanctions program in Iran. These are controversial and they attract a lot of retaliatory. They attract a lot of countermeasures. Excuse me, don't have enough coffee today. From other countries that feel it's the U.S. overextending their jurisdictional authority. These would include, for example, blocking statutes, which I'll discuss now. So in response to the Cuba and Iran sanctions, the EU, Mexico, Canada, and others have developed these so-called blocking statutes, which essentially prohibit their companies within those jurisdictions from complying with US sanctions. They are typically worded in a way that lets the companies still continue business in a way that's compliant with US sanctions, as long as there's another reason for that compliance. So compliance usually just can't be the sole reason for them, for example, refusing to do business in Iran or with Iranian companies. The effectiveness of these has not really been tested. There's been some effort by Germany and to a lesser degree France to enforce the EU blocking statute. But for the most part, companies have enough wiggle room that they are able to be compliant with both jurisdictions. There's also been an effort in the EU to create this so-called special purpose vehicle to allow for certain trade with Iran. But again, this has never really been tested. And it's really been limited, to my knowledge, to just humanitarian goods, which the US doesn't really restrict under their sanctions against Iran anyway. Another lesson learned is that sanctions do have a diminishing effect over time. And I think, again, we see this with the Cuban sanctions, North Korean sanctions, and Iranian sanctions in particular. Their sanctions really have the most impact when they're initially imposed. And this is because the sanctions targets have to scramble to figure out what this means, how's it going to affect our supply chains. And that's when they're most likely, I think, to change the behavior, which is the whole point of sanctions. And decision-making as a response to that. I think for that reason, when we impose sanctions, another lesson learned is that they should be developed with an exit strategy and a clear policy objective. It should be an achievable exit strategy too. Oftentimes simply regime change is unrealistic. And for that reason, limited restrictions may be the most effective that are aimed at more realistic, achievable changes in decision-making versus like wholesale changes within a country's government, which are always going to be a harder pill to swallow. The effectiveness of sanctions does taper off over time. This is because countries find alternative supply chains and they can form alliances that allow them to work outside of the US and to the extent it would apply the EU restrictions. And we've seen this with Cuba and Iran, and we're seeing it almost in real time with Russia developing alternative supply chains with North Korea and China. There are also enforcement challenges with sanctions. There's a saying that says they're only as strong as the enforcement behind them. And so what this means is OFAC really has limited resources. So the regulators there have to pick and choose which cases they choose to investigate and bring enforcement matters in. And this really pushes them to try to engage in what's known as big game hunting. So they're looking for not necessarily like every sanctions violation, but like the ones that are going to result in big penalties, lots of press with well-known companies, and things that are otherwise going to help educate the public on the restrictions. There hasn't been much enforcement against individuals, but every year there's some, so it happens. And we tend to see a focus on certain industries. In the recent years, it's been the finance and cybersecurity industries. And you can see down at the bottom in the last 5 years or so, there's been limited enforcement matters, only a maximum of 19 in 2021. And every year we tend to see 1 or 2 enforcement matters that really fills out and inflates the aggregate total number of penalties that are accrued by OFAC. And I think the final lesson I'd like to highlight here is the need for industry buy-in. Industry cooperation is really critical for sanctions compliance. OFAC, I think, recognizes that outreach and education, or especially on the extra-jurisdictional reach, are important for non-US companies. And so they do conduct outreach initiatives and seminars. And they, as I mentioned in the last slide, they use enforcement to highlight key issues, I think, important to non-US companies. And so one theme we've seen from the last few years too is a number of enforcement actions highlighting this so-called causing liability, especially when it involves US dollars. There is a reliance on OFAC because they have limited resources on self-reporting by industry. And so they've done this in two ways. So they provide a significant reduction in potential liability for companies that voluntarily self-report their violations. Oftentimes those companies will have no monetary penalty. They'll just receive a warning letter if they file voluntary self-disclosure. And if there is a penalty, it'll be significantly reduced from those maximums that we discussed. More recently, since 2022, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, which is another agency within the Department of Treasury, they've developed a sanctions whistleblower program that will award 10 to 30% of any recovered funds from sanctions tips. And so we're already seeing the effects of this. In 2023, 2 of the 16 enforcement actions referenced this whistleblower program, suggesting that perhaps they were the product of those tips. And both of the enforcement actions so far this year have referenced the program. One more, I think, point, especially from the Russia sanctions, is that the reputational effect for companies is often nearly as important as the legal effect. Especially for publicly traded companies, their value can see a significant dip if they are accused of having some dealings with a sanctioned entity or sanctioned company. And with the Russia sanctions, we really saw this with Yale University's Selly Institute had published a list of companies that were continuing to do business in Russia. That got picked up by the press and was republished in like the New York Times, USA Today. And I think it brought a lot of public pressure on those companies to really quickly wind down their business, even if it was technically lawful under US sanctions. And so that's another way that I think US policy can be implemented, even outside the legal bases that we discussed here today. So with that, I will turn it back over to Mel to introduce Patricia. Thank you.
Mel, you're on mute.
Okay, I'm on you. Patricia Shoka is the founder of Energy Bridge Global and a subject matter expert in energy and security based in Washington, D.C. Previously, she was a policy officer at the European Commission in Brussels, focusing on US-EU energy relations and cybersecurity. Patricia is an active member of Future Congress, where she advocates for the integration of scientific and technological knowledge into the American legislative process. Patricia is a fellow at Oxford University, the Payne Institute at Colorado School of Mines, and Tufts University's Fletcher School. She earned her degrees in political science and economics in London and a master's in strategic intelligence studies in Washington, D.C. I'm pleased to present Patricia Shoka. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mel and all. And Tyler, thank you for a great presentation there as well. I think it really sets the stage nicely for the next one. So when considering the legal implications of what you shared here, Tyler, I mean, obviously it's evident that sanctions are more than just economic measures. They hold substantial political sway. Crafting policy recommendation really requires a nuanced approach that really carefully balance economic impacts with geopolitical objectives. So keeping a question in mind would be, how can we align these immediate economic strategies with the broader, often complex landscape of international diplomacy? So on that part, now that Tyler kind of set the stage on the legal way, which was excellent, I really want to take you more into a case study approach, kind of looking at the geopolitical impact, looking also at Russia's energy and specifically minerals, but also uranium dependency and future directions. And so, yeah. So since Russia's invasions of Ukraine, its geopolitical landscape as a major commodity suppliers has transformed dramatically. The EU, the US, the UK, and the G7 have imposed intricate sanctions designed to weaken Russia's economy by limiting access to market finance technology, hence obstructing its war efforts. Not all nations have joined these sanctions, like Tyler presented it there. India and China has emerged as a pivotal market for Russia, helping very much so in countering Western sanction of its own measures. So despite the West's attempt at economic isolation, Russia has shown resiliency by pivoting towards the Asian market, as we've seen recently with Putin's visit in China, but also in North Korea, really impacting the global commodity market. One thing I would like to share with you as well is the recent G7 event that happened, and the U.S. Treasury published kind of the outcome and summary of that G7, which were a lot of press coverage, but not towards specific, core focus and element that I think are worth pointing in this presentation. One of them are assessing export control, and I think this is really important, where the G7 will continue to assess the risk arising out of export of dual-use technologies. By dual use, I mean goods and services and technology that can be used for both civilian and military purposes. So they can also refer to any technology that serve more than one purpose at a time. So that could be telecommunication, that could be satellite technology, and so forth. So that's really something that is extremely important, because the G7 leaders stop short of promising to impose new export control, but their statement indicate that they will consider additional export control. So at the same time, they called for China to refrain from export control that could cause significant global supply chain disruptions, particularly export control on critical minerals. When you compare the sanctions done by the US versus the EU, again, Tyler did a really good job there. On the EU side, obviously the 12 package of sanction introduced tighter compliance rules to support the implementation of oil price cap and clamp down on circumvention. And again, this is very much more on ship to vessels transfer, where, for instance, Iran is, has been very good at changing cargoes, to name it a UK cargo, while it's been an Iranian cargo. So they've put in place this automatic identification system called AIS that allow them to track systems and ship used on that front. So sanctions on Russia intensifies in 2022, targeting various sectors, including energy and minerals, and these sanctions are designed to constrain Russia's economic capabilities. However, there's significant compliance challenges for companies and government, especially as those sanctions are changing quite often. So how do you navigate these changes? So they're very complex, constantly evolving in a really dynamic regulatory landscape. So the frequent updates and notification to sanction lists really creates difficulties for business to stay compliant. The effectiveness of sanction targeting Russia's energy sector, specifically in light of the invasion of Ukraine, really requires a nuanced approach. I think that these sanctions have aimed to squeeze the primary source of revenue for Russia, giving its heavy reliance on energy export. But the sector's resilience and Russia's strategic response have really much led to mixed outcome. And one critical aspect is that sanctions, particularly from the West, were designed not to disrupt current energy supplies, but to increase the cost and challenges for Russia in developing future technologies demanding energy projects. So we've seen a lot of press coverage about deep water investment, Arctic offshore, shale oil projects. So all of these, it's really much to create a long-term impact by hindering Russia's access to crucial technology and the financing necessary for this project. Russia has obviously managed to sustain its oil output and exports by redirecting shipments to Asia, among other strategies. But this redirection not only weakened the intended impact of sanction, but also underscores the global nature of the energy market, not just volatility, but where demand from one region can really offset reduced access to another. And we've seen also these efforts, despite what Treasury Janet Yellen said, highlighting the coalition's actions in degrading Russia's military-industrial complex and reducing its war revenues being the absolute the key goals. So the accumulation of financial and technological sanctions coupled with an adverse business climate did start showing, exacerbating Russia's existing vulnerabilities in the energy sector. And in response, what we're seeing is Russia pursuing policies like import substitutions, diversification towards Asia, with some equipment and technology that could be replaced domestically or through Asian partners, dependencies, or advanced Western technologies as well. That remains a significant challenge. So this really much resolved into, we end up with the emergence of three distinct groups, which is summarized, I would say, nicely what Tyler showed. One is countries that are willing to trade with Russia. We've got countries that are energy independent on Russia and countries that are not energy secure, but they must take a neutral position. And this would support further the sanction picking and set us back from our global energy security and transition goal at that point. So the current landscapes of sanctions against Russia in 2024 really shows continued and intensified effort by the United States, the EU, and its allies to restrict Russia's military capabilities. And these sanctions are specifically designed to target Russia's tactique, military, industrial supply chain, and future energy revenue. So I think now we're moving more towards a strategic approach towards sanction rather than the one-size-fits-all methodology that we may have seen in the past. So now taking you into the metals and mining aspect with the impact of sanctions and its implications.
I don't know. And I'm just like, I don't know how to respond.
So Western sanctions have significantly targeted the metal and mining sectors, with the US, the EU, and the UK, and the G7 implementing a series of restrictive measures since February of 2022. And these sanctions have introduced various trade barriers, from additional tariff, but also a ban of trading Russian metal products like aluminium, copper, nickel, and steel. The scope of sanction expanded dramatically, I think much more in the commodity market starting in December 2023, when the UK government enacted an embargo under 19 commodity codes, which is what Tyler mentioned before, significantly broadening the spectrum of affected products to include both base and minor metals like cobalt, tungsten, which are known as strategic metals, because of its involvement in the defense sector. In the US, so we've seen the Treasury has issued a new determination through the Executive Order 14068, which prohibit the import into the US of aluminium, copper, and nickel from Russia, if it was originated and produced after April 13 of this year. So I think that's a really interesting aspect as well, especially given the timing when you look at the whole geopolitical aspect. But also one more thing that I want to peel off what Tyler mentioned before when it comes to the UK taking a bigger role when it comes to these sanctions is we're seeing also metal exchanges being involved, like the London Metal Exchange, the LME, and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, the SME, prohibiting and that from accepting new aluminium, copper, and nickel produced by Russia. So metal exchange really provides a central role in facilitating the trading of industrial metals around the globe. I think by taking joint action here, the US and the UK are really depriving Russia slowly of its metal production, but also of an important source of revenue for them. So looking at the Iranian dependency and future direction, so obviously rare earth and other minerals are essential for the energy transition. That's a word that we've been overhearing quite a bit, especially when it comes to wind, solar, the defense, and all the gadgets that we've been using on a daily basis. the demand for this critical raw material is definitely skyrocketing. Hence, we talk so much about supply chain, but we are at a point now where it far exceeded current supply. And we cannot achieve, like we say, it's so much. We talk about climate neutrality. It's impossible without these minerals. So we really have to focus on that. It's a significant challenge for Europe, who heavily depends on these critical raw material, especially from China, but also from Russia. So I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine represent the most dangerous realignment of global supply chain that we've seen in a generation, where the US is absolutely not prepared for. And as America and NATO also impose further economic sanction against Russia, establishing supply chains are obviously being disrupted. It's not just Russian oil and gas and the banking sector that are at risk, but it's really much about America's reliance on mineral imports is a glaring vulnerability. And we're going to see that much more, especially that the focus right now is on the upcoming election, but also keeping an eye on the conflict. So the reason why I'm taking you into uranium, and I will explain on that soon here, is Russia has strategically embraced global trade while preparing for political and economic isolation. And as part of that preparation, I think we're seeing Russia developing its own natural resource and investing in mineral assets worldwide. In the meantime, the US has enjoyed, the luxury of sourcing basic materials, but really has neglected its own natural resource wealth. It's not something that we've been looking at much. So Russia provides about 37% of the world palladium, around 18% of potash, 14% of coal. It controls 10% of global copper reserved. So obviously geology, mineral deposits, they don't respect political borders. I think across the border from Russia, Ukraine also harbors several strategic mineral deposits, which is not a primary cause of Russia's aggression, but it certainly play a strategic role in Putin's calculation. And I think we're seeing this much more recently. Ukraine, it's worth keeping in mind, although not many people are talking about it, but it's one of Europe's largest commodity producers, and it hosts 5% of the world's natural resource. I would not say those names in terms of regions in Ukraine, because I will not pronounce it well, but all I would say is if you look at the Poltava regions, which is very close to the Russia border, there's about 7% of the world's iron ore reserved. So Ukraine has the largest uranium deposit in Europe, which is 1.8% of the world's known uranium deposit, which is about 1 billion ton, which is pretty important. So the realignment of the global supply chain, with Russia controlling a larger share of the world's critical mineral, means directly impacting strategic US industries, including aerospace, and the transition to clean energy. We've seen the CEO of Boeing recently disclosed that tensions over Ukraine could really create an adverse climate for their business, given that 20% of the world's proven titanium ore reserves are in Ukraine. So sanctions really impact the titanium supply chain. I mean, for those military buffs, as we know, the 812 or the Skunk Work project from Lockheed, the SR-71, made out of titanium, that's titanium coming from those regions. So if you look at the whole military complex, there is a huge impact there. When it comes to sanctions impacting the titanium supply chain, is automatically impacting US ability to manufacture aircraft. The US has few alternatives for titanium outside of Ukraine, other than China or Russia. Ukraine is one of the few countries with a complete titanium industry, from mining to processing the ore to manufacturing special metals for the aerospace. So last year, China was the largest importer of Ukrainian titanium, taking about 24% of the supply. with Russia being second with 15%, 1.5, and Turkey was third with 14%. So Ukraine is aware of the potential wealth of its areas and the strategic importance of the energy transition. So obviously they're starting to promote its critical minerals through what we call an electronic auction that started last year. I think in early 2021, the number of proposals that Ukraine got jumped to 100, with mineral investment program expected to reach $10 billion for 24 major mineral projects that got cleared. So when you look at the Donetsk and Dobra lithium mines, they were up for sale in Ukraine, which is very interesting when you look at the current discussions on the geopolitical and diplomatic side. There were a lot of competition between European lithium and Chinese lithium for a position in Europe's lithium industry. Obviously, China has been tacit support of Russia's action in Ukraine, so it's predictable about who will develop those mines. But really, you know, I think the mineral now really lies behind an iron curtain, as we could say. So really, the U.S. must develop its domestic mining industry to ensure supply security. As I said, there's a huge reliance from the U.S. for renewable technology, defense, and high-tech minerals. And I think the U.S. mining supply chain needs attention, needs investment before we face more cutoffs and we scramble domestically. The U.S. has access to all the necessary resources. It's not like we cannot do it at home. We have great allies as well. I think where the challenge lies is mostly on the production and the refinement capacity to meet its needs. I think the supplies take time to bring online, so they cannot be switched on like you would switch on a light or turn on an EV. So disruption happens overnight, as we know, and Russia is aware of that. They do recognize that mineral supply and production take a lot of time. And I think that now we're seeing really Russia and China being the dominant commodity supply chain lead, especially now that we're scrambling and looking for more innovation, AI coming into the game, which adds even more resource to its capabilities. So I think the US and the allies really must prepare for supply chain disruption with strategic long-term investment in domestic and allied supply chain. Obviously, we've heard a lot of time we've heard the notion of energy security, but I think we need to put it into perspective. And the reason I say that is primarily because we frequently use that word, but it's not well defined. And I think, you know, for the sake of the conversation, I would say that energy security is the low vulnerability of vital energy systems. So there are really two main ideas in that definition. The first is that it's not the energy security of a black box, but the energy security of a specific system, be it oil and gas, utilities. So it's, you know, that's a core area. The second idea included in that definition is the notion of vulnerability. So to examine vulnerabilities, you have to look at how energy systems concerns have evolved in history. And there's three core elements and persistent concerns that we're seeing, which I think is good to keep in mind when you look at issues like the energy security aspect, but also when you look at uranium, when you look at all the sanctions on the energy. One is from a sovereignty perspective. Us sitting here in the US, we need to answer the question of who controls the energy. Do we import all our oil and gas and minerals from a single country like Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, or do we produce it locally? The second is how long our energy system will last. And I think this is really the notion of robustness, which is our infrastructure, is our infrastructure ready to withstand different types of threats? And the third one is the perspective of resilience, which asks the question of when we face a disruption, how quickly can the system respond and recover? So when I keep sharing those data points here, but I think it's worth kind of taking you deeply into the uranium case, where we look at the EU and the US actual level of dependence on uranium, and their effort to develop and expand their nuclear industries. When we look at uranium, it can be uranium enrichment, new nuclear fuels, especially SMR. We're talking about the small modular reactor, a lot more. So I think a swift break from Russia's dependence is not feasible for Western policymakers, because they're trying to build up their own nuclear industry. And I think it's essential for that notion of energy security that I mentioned. On May 13 of this year, US President Joe Biden signed a law banning uranium imports from Russia. This news was obviously overshadowed by other events related to Russia, and that's the reason why I'm taking this here as a core focus, because the law has significant implication for US nuclear power. Initially, that law was introduced in the US House of Representatives in February 2023. The legislation balanced the need to cut off significant revenue source for Russia with the demand for enriched nuclear fuel to keep the US reactor fleet operational. So it's obviously a real challenge to navigate those two, as obviously the US has a huge interest in uranium. As you know, Rosatom is an important company, an important player in Russia, as they ensure uranium supplies for the American market. In 2021, it accounted for 14% of the US uranium supply and 28% of enrichment services. A lot of lobbyists, US lobbyists, wanted to ensure that the civil nuclear industry would not be included in the anti-Russian sanctions. So really the presidential order that came in was, in 2022, initially didn't add nuclear in the list of energy sources prohibited for import, because that would hurt the US more than anything. So now in 2023, was the time where there was a steady expansion of American sanctions against Rosatom. And we're seeing, so far, 10 Rosatom subsidiaries have been put into the US sanctions. Those are the 10 that you're seeing listed here. And again, it's very interesting to see the areas of activities when it comes to that. Because they were aimed foremost at non-nuclear operation, predominantly related to shipping and cooperation with defense industries or entities, operating predominantly in third world countries. But the restrictive measures haven't so far touched key Rosatom subsidiaries like the 10X or the TVEL, which are really, really important subsidiaries for Rosatom, because they advance nuclear fuel cycle services to the West, which are heavily dependent on. So the US can really source uranium from several countries other than Russia. Canada and Kazakhstan are the top two exporters of uranium for the US. 27%, 25% of US uranium imports, respectively. Russia supplied 12% of US uranium in 2022, which plays a crucial role in the nuclear fuel supply chain, particularly in uranium conversions and enrichment. So when you look at that, I mean, it's billions of dollars that are still contributed from the US to Russia, even though the US is still trying to divest with Canada and so forth. The only enrichment capability in the US is at a facility in New Mexico. It's done by a company called Urenco, which is a multinational co-owned by British and Dutch governments. And they've been, helping tremendously on that front as well. The US Congress has also taken a critical step in sanctioning Russia and reducing dependence on Russian nuclear fuel. I think Tyler explained that really well. When it comes to that, there's strong commitment from the US government and industry to do more domestic enrichment to ensure independence here, as opposed to just relying heavily on sources like in Russia. Uranium is a really it has a really distinct feature because it has so many different segments for mining to processing, reprocessing, storage, the construction of reactors. So really, there's 6 main elements of Rosatom's strategic geoeconomic importance for the Russian state. First is the extraction aspect, because Russia mines only 5% of the global uranium supply. And Rosatom are mining more uranium abroad than in Russia. And we're seeing recently, we've seen Putin going to Kazakhstan, which uranium was a big part of it, because in May 2023, he acquired 49% stake in the second largest uranium mine in Kazakhstan, which is currently the biggest uranium reserve in the world. Russia controls 40% of global processing facilities and 46% of total enrichment capacity. The third is Russians are ahead of their Western counterpart in producing new types of fuel required for the next generation of nuclear reactors, which is called HALEU, HALEU, which is, trying to get more on the commercial side. So we're really seeing a competition with the US and Russia when it comes to that. The other aspect is Rosatom is obviously playing a key role in the world in terms of constructing nuclear reactors outside of its country. Now they have 23 projects being built and 8 overseas, and the 8 are in Bangladesh, Belarus, China, Egypt, Hungary, India, Turkey, and Iran. So I would let you conclude on those countries, given what's happening and the plan there. Rosatom's revenues are smaller in comparison to the main Russian hydrocarbon giants that we're seeing. Obviously, oil is still a huge revenue for Russia, but I think that when you look at their portfolio in 2022, it's about $136 billion, $1 billion from trade coming from the US, and 720 million from economic operation with the EU. So obviously, they play, besides being a huge nuclear giant, they have a huge role in LNG, the liquefied natural gas market, because they produce a lot of equipment, and they're key developer in lithium mines, both at home and abroad. And as we know, lithium demand is skyrocketing given where we're heading with our technology. Last but not least, I would say that the recent US policy actions needs more radical measures when it comes to addressing, dependencies on Rosatom. I think we need more policy attentions, favorable market conditions, but also new infrastructures coming in. Really requires a shift in our resiliency and reliance. We need to continue to invest in domestic mining and enrichment capabilities, keeping in mind that, a lot of the legislation and the compliance aspect is very daunting and challenging, but also developing a really domestic supply chain will definitely require sustained commitment and strategic vision and long-term investment. So with that, I will stop here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Really appreciate it. We now have questions and answers, Q&As.